Achal?
Yes, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let me start by welcoming everyone to this webinar on this very important topic, which is building synergies and linkages between biodiversity and infrastructure development. This webinar will be focusing on reconciling biodiversity conservation and infrastructure development. We have a very eminent, distinguished set of panelists today, and they will be sharing their experiences and their knowledge. The webinar is being conducted by IUCN and UNEP together. Now I would like to hand over to Mr. Atul Bagai sir to share the welcoming remarks with all the participants.
Good afternoon and thanks. I would like to welcome on behalf of IUCN and UNEP Uma Devi ji, the Additional Secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. Also, I would like to welcome all the distinguished panelists and our colleagues from IUCN headquarters. I am extremely thankful to Dr. Vivek Saxena for thinking of such an important issue for discussions today and of collaborating with UNEP on this. We certainly have a very distinguished panel on such a critical issue, which came also to focus recently when the disaster struck in Uttarakhand. Of course, there is no still strong scientific evidence behind the reasons and causes of the catastrophe in Uttarakhand. But I was reading recently a report which ICIMOD brought out, trying to link up what happened in Uttarakhand with the kind of infrastructure development that is taking place. So as I said, one has to be cautious in terms of how you approach these issues. But certainly there's no denying the fact that there is a very close link between infrastructural development and biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. And while both development and environment need to go hand in hand, we need to really look at the fragile ecosystems and biodiversity that could get affected by the developments that are taking place, which are also very necessary for a country's economic growth. I'm very happy to be associated with IUCN on this very important topic, and I really look forward to very good discussions. And also, we are happy that Uma Devi ji has agreed to be presiding over this event today, because Ministry of Environment has done some remarkable work on providing guidelines in terms of how ecosystems and biodiversity needs to be conserved when infrastructure development is taking place. And those guidelines have really become the benchmarks for Ministry of Railways, for the Ministry of Transport, and most of the other infrastructure ministries in India. And I would say that those guidelines should be the guiding factor for whatever economic development that has to take place in India. So we're very happy that Uma Devi ji is here and we'll be able to hear her perspective in this regard also. I welcome everyone and thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your thoughtful and encouraging words. Now I request Dr. Vivek Saxena to kindly set the context for the webinar.
At the outset, let me welcome on behalf of IUCN for this very important webinar session on a very, very important thematic area. I am grateful to Mr. Bagai for his encouraging words and also for initiating partnership with the IUCN for organizing this webinar on a very, very important area, especially keeping in view the recent catastrophe which we witnessed in Uttarakhand, as we just mentioned. And also in last 1 year also, which we are all witnessing that brought entire world at crossroads, and everywhere we are discussing that in what we should build, in what way, what should we have our development pathways, in what way our cities should look like, in what way our vehicle, in what way our infrastructure should develop. And these all things are very much related to the biodiversity conservation issue, especially in the of IUCN recently launched nature-based solution standards, which have come at a very, very appropriate time, because certainly, especially in India, where we have a lot of demographic pressures and at the same time we have a development challenges also. But at the same time, we should also remember that Earth has been provided appropriate space in the ecosystem, and we as human beings or Homo sapiens is one of the species, and we have to ensure that and recognize the important role of all the species, because if we think of only the particular ecosystem space is important for the development of human being, and without taking care of the linkages or symbiotic relationship or ecosystem services which this linkages between various species that provide, and if we disrupt such ecosystem services, or by causing the degradation of the habitat or having the corridor disconnectivity or fragmentation of this corridor, there is always a threat for such type of outbreak of pandemic which we are witnessing now. So biodiversity conservation linkage with the infrastructure development has very, very important role. And IUCN under its IUCN Business and Biodiversity Program is supporting various corporates also in India, especially some of the examples like the Tata Group. For the Tata Steel, IUCN facilitated their group level biodiversity policy, the formulation of the biodiversity management plan and having the oversight. Similarly, for the Hindalco Group, for the GSW and some of these corporates, which have realized that they have to go for the group level biodiversity policy. From the Aditya Birla Group today, we will be listening Mr. Sandeep Shrivastava also. So we have an eminent panelist today. I'm also grateful to Ms. Uma Devi, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change at the ministry level, because when we talk at the ministry level, still the focus remains mostly on the forest departments and those sectors, and thinking that forest conservation and water biodiversity through them is important. But at the same time, the most of these businesses which are dependent on the extractive sector related to the maybe the mines, the coal, the steel, and they all depend on the land resources or water resources. And in a way, the sustainability practices need to be incorporated into their business practices. And there, the role of biodiversity conservation is very, very important. So I would also request Ms. Uma Devi that in the ministry also, the focus, or you can say more dialogue with such sectors which are responsible or which have a very important role for biodiversity conservation. That interface, I think, needs to be enhanced. And we have a very important representation from the concerned ministries, from the transport also, and from the legal background, Mr. Sanjay Upadhyay, that what are the legal issues in biodiversity conservation. Ms. Julia from IUCN, our global team under the Business and Biodiversity Program. Dr. Raman Sukuma, who is himself an authority on the elephant conservation issues and has a vast experience that how the infrastructure has created a disconnect of the elephant corridors, which itself is causing a lot of challenging issues for the elephant conservation, because in India now we don't have a problem of a number of elephants. We have more than 30,000 elephants. But managing this human-elephant conflict, that has become more challenging, resulting in loss of human deaths, as well as loss of, apart from that, loss of crops, livestock, and other property. So these are some of the very, very challenging issues. And this is the beginning. And I hope in partnership with the UNEP, IUCN and UNEP on a common platform will bring out more and more such relevant discussions in future. And with these words, I welcome all the eminent panelists and all the participants today for this very, very important webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for setting the context. You rightly said that we need a plan for infrastructure development, and that's what we hope to achieve from today's discussion. Now I request Mrs. B.V. Uma Devi, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, to kindly address the gathering.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, IUCN, as well as you and UNEP, for giving me this opportunity to speak on the topic of dealing with the cumulative effects of linear infrastructures on biodiversity. So, as we all know, India is a leader in biodiversity conservation as well as biodiversity governance. And ours is a mega biodiverse country with 4 biodiversity hotspots with varieties of ecosystems ranging from forest, marine, agriculture, desert, and mountain ecosystems. And India accounts to nearly 8% of the recorded species of the world, with just 2.4% of the world's land area, even while supporting almost 18% of the human population as well as the cattle population. And the biodiversity, the biotic pressure on our biodiversity is therefore immense. And over 47,000 of species of the plants and almost around 1 lakh species of animals have been recorded so far in the country. And for India, conservation of its biodiversity is crucial not only because it provides several goods and services necessary for human survival, but also because it is directly linked with providing livelihoods and improving socio-economic conditions of millions of our local communities and people, thereby contributing to sustainable development and poverty alleviation. In pursuance of the CBD, that is the Convention on Biological Diversity, India enacted its Biological Diversity Act in 2002. And India is one of the first few countries to have enacted this such a comprehensive legislation on biodiversity. And the Act is implemented through a 3-tier institutional mechanism at national, state, and local levels. And at the national level, we have the National Biodiversity Authority. At the state level, we have the state biodiversity boards set up by the state governments. And we have the biodiversity management committees at the local or at the panchayat levels. And India is also a president for 2 conventions, namely Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, the CMS, and also on the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification, UNCCD, which are closely related to biodiversity conservation. Therefore, the challenge is to maintain healthy landscapes by development of green and eco-friendly through a development of green and eco-friendly mechanisms. There is a need to shift to a landscape approach in planning of linear infrastructure, along with capacity building of practitioners on eco-friendly infrastructure. We need to mainstream biodiversity conservation and policies, plans, programs, and also in the impact assessment of the studies. Impact assessment studies of the linear infrastructure projects to incorporate values of biodiversity conservation in location, design, operation of these projects, and for reducing environmental, social, and economic costs. So we need to focus on green and smart infrastructure by having landscape level plans, strategies with clear-cut biodiversity conservation goals. Linear infrastructure projects without proper planning, as I said earlier, has resulted in fragmentation of habitats, exposing the wild animals to road and rail accidents, leading to disturbance in breeding and foraging of birds because of artificial lights which are used on the road and rail corridors, restriction of the movements of animals leading to avoidance of the habitat near rail and road corridors, resulting in isolation and reduced viability of the affected populations, resulting in human-wildlife conflicts as mentioned by Mr. Saxena, due to human settlements near rail and road corridors, pollution of birds with the transmission lines, exposing human populations to zoonotic diseases. Then we need to have smart and green mitigation measures like construction of underpasses, land bridges, canopy bridges for movement of animals, and also non-structural measures such as the devices to reduce noise pollution, speed, volume of traffic, use of signages for warnings, etc. And some of the solutions These are all there in the guidelines issued by Minister of Environment and Forest already. And I'm sure today's deliberations in the webinars will come up with more and more of such solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your enlightening words and opening the webinar. Now we move on to the next segment of panel discussion. I request Dr. Divya Dutt, Program Management Officer of UNEP, to take the floor to moderate the session.
Thank you very much, Aanchal. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be moderating this very distinguished panel on this very critical issue. Let me just start by highlighting a recent report that UNEP has brought out. It is titled Making Peace with Nature, and it summarizes the scientific evidence that is coming out from various global assessments on climate, biodiversity, and pollution. And the messages are very stark. I mean, in the context of biodiversity, which is the focus of the discussion today, it essentially reiterates the findings of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that 1 million of the world's estimated 8 million species of plants and animals are today threatened with extinction. And many of the ecosystem services, which are essential for human well-being, are eroding at a rate which is faster than ever witnessed in history. The pandemic is, of course, one of the consequences of this erosion, but there are several others which manifest over time. For instance, the report sort of finds that the loss of pollinators threatens billions worth of food production annually with impacts on long-term food security. So, and of course, these are issues that are very well known to the panel here. The focus today is on linear infrastructure more broadly, which is an important element in the movement of people, goods, services. However, it can also lead to loss of habitat for other species. It can affect the free mobility of wildlife, and it can create disturbances such as vibrations, light and noise pollution, all of which can adversely affect biodiversity. We have a great panel today, so I'm going to let them do most of the talking and to dwell on how some of these impacts can be avoided or threatened, as seen from the perspective of different stakeholders who we have on the panel represented: the government, civil society, experts, and business. I will first quickly introduce our 5 panelists. I'll keep it brief because they don't really need an introduction, and then we will move to the panel discussion. So we have with us Mr. Amit Vardhan, who's the Joint Secretary, Transport and International Cooperation, among other divisions in the Ministry of Transport and Highways. Mr. Vardhan was previously the Joint Secretary at the Department of Heavy Industries, so he also brings that perspective. Dr. Raman Sukumar is a professor at the Center for Ecological Studies, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He is also the Managing Trustee, Asian Nature Conservation Foundation. He is, of course, best known for his work on the ecology of the Asian elephant and around wildlife-human conflict. Ms. Julia Carbon is the Deputy Director of the Business and Biodiversity Program at IUCN. Among her recent work is the area of responsible business operations in and around key biodiversity areas. Dr. Carbon previously was at UNEP working on tourism-related issues. So we will also have that perspective and that experience on the discussion today. Mr. Sandeep Srivastav is the Senior Vice President, Environment and Sustainability at the Aditya Birla Group. He has also worked with Ambuja Cement and with the Confederation of Indian Industry in the past. He is, in fact, a member of various CII committees on the environment and biodiversity. And last but not the least, we have Sanjay Upadhyay. Sanjay is the founder and managing partner of India's first environmental law firm, Enviro Legal Defense Firm. Sanjay has been practicing environment and development law since 1993 and is a well-known figure for all the work that he's done. And I would like to add that he's also been on the drafting committees of various biodiversity-related laws, both at the national and subnational level in India, also overseas. Without further ado, we will start the panel discussion. I will request the panelists to keep their interventions to about 10 minutes so that we have some time for question and answers at the end. And I will request our participants to keep adding the questions in the chat box. We will see how we take them up, how many we can take up. We will try and take up as many as possible towards the end of the session. So let me start with Mr. Vardhan. Mr. Vardhan, there has, of course, we've all been witnessing renewed focus on roads and highways as part of government policy in the last few years, including expansion and upgradation of existing road infrastructure in India. Could you speak a little bit and shed some light on how the government has sought to address the whole issue of conservation and connectivity of in its planning for infrastructure? And in particular, if you could sort of focus a little bit on how you think the science, technology, and policy interface can be better aligned in reconciling ecological connectivity as India looks to expand its road and highway network. So over to you, Mr. Vardhan.
Thank you very much. It's a matter of great pleasure and privilege to be on this forum. Thanks, Mr. Bagai and the UN for inviting me on this forum. Now, I'll be speaking about the environment-friendly initiatives that the ministry has taken in recent years. You see, over the years, India has witnessed a remarkable economic growth from $468 billion in 2000 to around $2.9 trillion in 2020. But concomitantly, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions has also increased rapidly. I'll set the context. The carbon dioxide emissions have increased from 532 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, that is empty CO2, in 1990 to about 2,277 in 2018. So that is an annual growth rate of more than 5%. So it's a very, very rapid growth of emissions as well. And if you look at the transport sector, this is one of the fastest growing sectors in the country. Now, between 1981 and 2011, while India's population grew by 77%, the number of vehicles grew 2,500 times during the same period. And the transport sector contributes to about 13% of the total carbon dioxide emissions. And of these, the road transport sector is responsible for more than 80% of the total emissions. So we have a disproportionately large role in the matter of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, naturally, this is a very serious issue which needs to be addressed. The country participated in the Paris Climate Change Agreement in the year 2015. Goals that were set was a reduction in the emission intensity of our GDP by 33 to 35% by the year 2030 as compared to the level of 2005. So within this context, the road transport sector has a very important role to play. Now, what have we done in this regard? What are the developments that have taken place and what do we plan to do in future? One is about the emission standards themselves. There is something known as Bharat Stage Emission Standards. This is BS norms, which we call. This is the maximum limit of exhaust emissions for vehicles sold in the country. Now, we were in a system of BS4, Bharat Stage 4, and we had to shift to BS5 and then to BS6. Now, with each increase in the level, the emission norms got tighter. But what we mandated was that there would be leapfrogging from BS4 to BS6, bypassing the level of BS5. So we had to achieve BS6 by the year 2024. But now we have achieved it this year itself, with effect from the 1st of April 2020. So there has been substantial tightening of emission norms by the sheer fact that we have bypassed BS5. Now, what has this done? This will help reduce particulate matter by about 10 times and other pollutant emissions by more than 50%. So this is it's a giant leap actually, with the help of all stakeholders, including the automotive sector. Then another thing is something known as CAFE norms. This is the Corporate Average Fuel Economy norms. In the year 2015, these norms were set for regarding fuel consumption standards for what we call M1 vehicles. M1 vehicles are motor vehicles used for carriage of passengers with not more than 8 seats. Now, what this says is these norms came into force from the 1st of April 2017. There are 2 phases. The phase 1 is from 2017 to 2022. We are in the midst of that. The target of carbon dioxide emission on a corporate average basis is 130 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer traveled. And phase 2, which will be from the 1st of April 2022, for the next 5 years, it is 113 grams per kilometer. And these norms are applicable for diesel, petrol, natural gas, etc. cars. Now, so far, the industry has been doing well. The last 3 years, it has reached the norms of about 121 to 122 grams per kilometer against the target of 130. Phase 2 is more challenging. And therefore, people are asking for a relaxation, which we haven't agreed to so far. Now, this we have laid down that there'll be 4 technologies which will further reduce these fuel emissions. These are 6 or more speed transmissions, that is, more efficient transmission of power onto the wheels. Then there'll be something known as a tire pressure monitoring system to have the optimum tire pressure that will conserve fuel. Then start-stop technology through the vehicle control unit at the in the operating conditions, and regenerative braking, which will convert the vehicle's kinetic energy into electrical energy during braking. So these 4 technologies have been laid down. In addition, we'll be pushing automakers to introduce alternate fuel vehicles and electric vehicles and hybrids. So that is the context for the future. We are doing a lot in that regard. I'll speak briefly about the use of alternate fuels. In our central motor vehicle rules, we have notified the use of CNG, bio-CNG, and LNG as fuels. Now, if you know, the CNG emissions on a tank-to-wheel basis, the greenhouse emissions are much better than gasoline. And bio-CNG, which is a purified form of CNG, has an even lower greenhouse gas impact. More so if this bio-CNG is produced from waste. Then hydrogen-enriched CNG has also been notified as an automotive fuel. By adding 18% hydrogen to CNG, the impact on these greenhouse gases will also reduce. And LNG has the potential of reducing these emissions by almost 30% when compared to diesel vehicles. So all these fuels have been notified. Recently, we have issued a notification for the retrofitment of CNG fuels on agricultural tractors as well. So that is a big segment which will shift from diesel to CNG. Then we are pushing the use of ethanol as well. There are studies which show that there is a reduction in carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons emissions in the case of ethanol as compared to gasoline in 2-wheelers and 4-wheelers. So we have issued several notifications for the use of E10. E10 is 10% of ethanol combined with 90% of gasoline. E85, E100, ED95, these are already notified. And recently we have notified E20, that is 20% ethanol with 80% gasoline as automotive fuel. So their mass emission standards have also been issued. This is a very recent phenomenon. 8th of March, we issued the notification. So all these steps we are taking to reduce fuel emissions by going in for alternative fuels. Then there is a big segment of electric vehicles. There are various kinds of electric vehicles. One is the pure battery electric vehicle, which uses only electric power. Then there is a strong hybrid, a vehicle in which either the engine or the motor can propel the vehicle independently. And there is a plug-in hybrid, which has a provision for off-vehicle charging of rechargeable energy storage system. Now, the greenhouse emissions in all these categories are much, much lower than the conventional internal combustion vehicles. Now, we have, apart from issuing these notifications, we have also granted exemption to e-carts and e-rickshaws from the requirement of getting permits for plying as commercial vehicles. And we have issued an advisory to all states and UTs that vehicles, these electric vehicles, can be sold and registered without batteries. If you are aware, battery accounts for about 40% of the cost of the electric vehicle. So by delinking that from the vehicle, the cost of the vehicle dips substantially, and that can result in a lot of increased adoption of EVs. And batteries can always be swapped. You can hire batteries and you can swap those batteries. So that would reduce the cost of electric vehicles. We have also issued notifications for retrofitment of hybrid electric system or electric kit to vehicles. Besides us, there's the earlier ministry where I used to work, the Department of Heavy Industries. It is giving incentives under the scheme called FAME, which is Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Hybrid and Electric Vehicles. It gives various incentives are given on the types of vehicles: 20,000 for two-wheelers, 50,000 for three-wheelers, 1.5 lakhs for four-wheelers, and 50 lakhs for buses. So that is also another big step towards promoting electric vehicles. Apart from all this, we have also notified the use of hydrogen fuel cell as an automotive fuel. So this also offers a low GHG emission. It's a very clean fuel, especially hydrogen, which is generated from renewable energy. It is called green hydrogen. So that is being done, and we are getting trials undertaken through the government of Kerala. So these are some important steps that we have taken. If you are aware, on our tolls, on the highways we have tolls, we have shifted to electronic toll collection. And recently we have mandated that all the gates should be, you can cross the gates only using FASTag instead of cash or other modes of payment. So that obviates the need for stopping at the toll gates. So there's no waiting time, and therefore there is no fuel consumption on that account, no congestion. So that also reduces emissions. And on the highways, we have issued this policy called Green Highways Plantation, Transplantations, Beautification and Maintenance Policy in 2015, with the aim of greening the highway corridors with the participation of the community, farmers, private sectors, NGOs, etc. So we are undertaking massive plantations all along the highways. And we also have a mobile app, which is called Harit Path. And we are undertaking geotagging in over 300 projects. More than 3 lakh plants have been already geotagged. People are being trained accordingly. So we are ensuring sustainability of the green corridor along national highways. So these are some, and now we are in the midst of formulating a vehicle scrappage policy. We are saying that vehicles which fail the fitness test will be grounded and scrapped. So that is a policy in the works. It has been announced in the budget, and we are going, we will be coming out with various notifications. So these are various steps towards a more environment-friendly country, and we are actively taking several other steps also. In future. We'll come out with more and more such steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vardhan. That was very informative, and you know, it's sort of great that there is so much happening on fuel standards, on clean fuels, e-mobility, on plantations. And I'm sure that all of this will directly and indirectly, apart from the impact on pollution and on climate change, it will also have impacts on biodiversity. I'm going to turn to Dr. Sukumar now. Dr. Sukumar, we've just heard from Dr. Vardhan about how road infrastructure planning in India is sort of addressing environment-related issues with indirect impacts on conservation also. Based on your years of experience in species conservation, especially that of the Asian elephant, how do you think we can strengthen a landscape approach to infrastructure planning in the country for ensuring habitat connectivity? And could you share with us some examples of practices that you may have seen already in the country that have been effective in ensuring habitat connectivity in infrastructure development?
Thank you very much. I must first compliment IUCN for putting this webinar together. I hope I'm audible to all of you because my internet connection is slightly unstable here in my, in my forest abode. So
you are very clear, sir. We can hear you very well.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Vardhan has given his perspective on the of how do we reduce carbon emissions and increase energy efficiencies, which are of course all very important in the ongoing climate change crisis that we are all facing. And India's NDCs are our national determined contributions that we have pledged to the UN Framework Convention. However, at this, I would like to give a somewhat complementary or a somewhat different perspective as a biologist who is very concerned about the integrity of our biological landscapes. And what I have seen in terms of linear infrastructure, if not properly implemented, how it can mess up both with our natural landscapes. At the same time, it can also, kind of put the brakes on climate change adaptation of our plant and animal populations, for which we need integral landscapes. The Additional Secretary, in fact, very briefly mentioned this need for us to protect our biological landscapes. And, starting about 30 years ago, I played a major role in defining some of these biological landscapes for the Asian elephant. But of course, these are biological landscapes, not just for the elephant, it's also for the tiger and for a host of plant and animal species. And in the context of an ongoing climate change, in fact, all the hundreds of thousands of millions of species that we're talking about will have to move. Given global warming, the climates that any given region or location is experiencing today is going to change in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. And therefore, all species of plants and animals will have to move in order to adapt. Okay, so mitigation is one side of the climate change coin. I have also been contributing to the work of the IPCC over the past 30 years. But countries like India are also emphasizing the need for adaptation. And without adaptation, we'll have species extinctions eventually. So I would certainly underline the importance, the vital importance to avoid the threat of further fragmentation of our biological landscapes. And that's very important. By that, I mean both in physical terms and in functional terms. So in physical terms, you might put a road, through a hill area. Birds can fly across. Maybe plants can disperse their seeds across the road. But certainly there would be, a host of species which will not be able to get across unless we put in structures that would enable animals to cross. And I'm not just talking about large animals like elephants and so on, but a number of other species may not be able to get across. Therefore, it's imperative that we do landscape scale planning and we keep the requirement of preventing further habitat fragmentation. Now, let me throw the ball in the court of those who want further infrastructure. I'm acutely aware of the need that India is a growing economy. And in recent years, sitting on various high-level committees, I also note the added dimension of border security, national security issues, which require infrastructure, especially in our border areas, in the Himalaya and so on. And therefore, we are going to continue to build infrastructure. I would say that we need to have an integrated long-term approach to linear infrastructure in landscapes. And by that, I mean that we need to identify, we need to project our infrastructure needs for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. And we need to identify the paths or the corridors. We need to have, just like we talk about corridors for animal movement, we need to have corridors for major infrastructure, where all the major infrastructure can be routed through and not take a piecemeal approach. Unfortunately, today what's happening is that we have a highly piecemeal approach. Let me take the Western Ghats, one region with which I've been familiar over the last 40 years, is that you get, there is a demand for a road that cuts across the Western Ghats, there's a road for a railway line that cuts across the Western Ghats, and so on and so forth. And these seem to come in a piecemeal manner. Now, I'm aware of the fact that Western Ghats are a historical geographic accident, because we have a very long coastline and we have a very large peninsula, and they have to be connected. You can't say that, people from, Mumbai have to go, all the way down the west coast, go around Kanyakumari and then come back into the Deccan Plateau or whatever. I'm not saying that. But we need to identify areas which have the least potential for causing disruption or fragmentation of habitat. Of course, the most obvious geographically is the Palghat Gap. The Palghat Gap is a gap through which you can a lot of infrastructure. The Palghat Gap happened, in geological time a very long time ago. You can't really cause further habitat fragmentation along the Western Ghats. But so like this, we need to be able, we need to identify other areas where we can provide the corridors for infrastructure development. And then, so this will be the go areas. At the same time, we need to have the non-go areas, which I will come to a bit later in my remarks. The second point I would like to make is that mitigation measures must be adequate. When we talk about animal passages, my experience is that yes, whether it's the highways or railways or whatever, they say, yes, money is not the problem. You give us a plan for infrastructure and we'll do it. But my experience is that there's been very little monitoring of what actually happens, once the infrastructure is actually put in. And my recent travels, both in the Western Himalaya and in the Eastern Himalaya, very, very recent, has convinced me that, when you start cutting hill slopes in an ecologically fragile landscape like the Himalaya, which is, I don't need to go in to explain to all of you the fragility of the Himalaya. But, it's just been devastating, to put it in very, very simple terms. I don't think any norms have been followed when infrastructure, especially roads have been developed. Entire hillsides are caved in. And I don't want to go into specific details of the states and where this has happened, but this has happened both in the Western Himalaya and in the Eastern Himalaya, where you have ongoing infrastructure. And some of this is essential. I am also aware of the fact that you can't avoid some of this infrastructure development, but it's essential. But the problem has been that, environmental norms have simply been routed and not been followed, when we are doing this. And therefore, when an agency asks for clearance for, a certain amount of forested area, let's say you ask for 20 hectares of forest, the 20 hectares of forest eventually becomes 200 hectares of forest, which is actually lost because of this development, which, where you have hillsides caving in and, a lot of muck being the valley, whichever the agency is developing roads have not paid sufficient attention. Tunneling, I know that tunnels are very expensive, but I think we need to give more thought to we can use tunnels. The last thing I would say is that non-essential infrastructure should not be permitted. By this, I mean that if you take Western Ghats, for instance, okay, you have the Shengota Gap where you have a railway line and you have a major highway going through. Strengthen it by all means. But put in all the mitigation structures that are needed to provide habitat connectivity. There is a corridor that's already been lost. I'm just giving these as examples. But we need to plan this across all our different landscapes, whether it's the Western Ghats, whether it's the forests of Central India, whether it's the Himalayan region or whatever. But in between the Shengota Gap and the Kanyakumari, you have a major forested stretch, which is pristine today, which is, one of the most biodiverse forest areas, both in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And we should not ask for, a new road to be built. We should not ask for a new railway line to be put into this. Okay, so you strengthen by all means an existing corridor that is there and putting mitigation measures to allow animals to cross through or whatever. But for heaven's sake, please let us not ask for, new roads and new railway lines. Because again, going by measures of reduction of carbon emissions or energy efficiency, if you go through a road which is let's say I do a road journey which is 100 kilometers through a good road versus doing a journey through a bad road which is 70 kilometers long. I save 30 kilometers, but at the end of the day I end up spending as much fuel and as much going through a road in a hilly terrain or a bad road or whatever as compared to a good road. So by all means, let's put in good roads with all the mitigation measures that are needed, but let us not overstretch this argument by saying that we need infrastructure and connectivity everywhere along our ecologically fragile areas. I'll just end my remarks with just a remark about the road versus railway lines. I see that, all of us would agree that the energy efficiency of railway lines is much higher than that of roads. And in a country like India, our emphasis should be on developing railway infrastructure rather than roads, public transportation rather than private transportation. A lot of people have spoken in the last 10, 20 or 30 years, but I'm not sure that we are really kind of moving in that direction. and kind of emphasizing role of public transportation versus private transportation, by encouraging the automobile industry versus the railway industry. I can't help but make a remark about FASTag because Mr. Vardhan mentioned this. I must mention that yes, FASTag is a wonderful idea, but India being with all our pride in our digital information technology and so on, what I found is I threw away 2 FASTags which I got from 2 nationalized banks. They just did not work. There's a 50% chance that they would work on a certain highway, and it was very frustrating. Finally, I got a good FASTag, or rather, got a FASTag for me from a private bank, and it has worked very well over the last time. Not do it, but let's, for heaven's sake, use our infrastructure, IT technology and all the whatever pride that we have in that to ensure that our FASTags work seamlessly in our highways. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sukumar. We heard some really good points about the whole issue of long-term integrated approach to infrastructure planning. But I was particularly, what caught my attention is this issue of no-go areas. And I think we've heard this previously also in public discourse on environmental issues and on, on biodiversity. But it's still something that we need to sort of integrate strongly in the policy and regulatory framework. And I do recall that even in the policy of 2006, there is reference to no-go wildlife areas. And I hope we can come back to some of these issues in the course of our discussion in the Q&A session. But I'm going to turn now to Dr. Julia Carbon, who is with IUCN. Dr. Carbon, in what we are hearing, not necessarily in the discussion today, but generally what we hear is that infrastructure development and biodiversity are usually considered to be on extreme ends of the spectrum. And the act of reconciling the two is often seen as a very difficult proposition. Based on your own work globally and from IUCN's work on reconciling objectives, what do you think are some of the key takeaways for countries like India on ecologically sensitive development of linear infrastructure, or even large-scale renewable energy projects, for instance? And if you have any, takeaways or examples to share on some of the issues that Dr. Sukumar just raised on infrastructure corridors or no-go areas globally, it'll be very good to hear on that as well. So over to you, Dr. Carbon.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you and to all for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to talk about these issues. I think I'd like to use the opportunity from one of the last comments you made, using renewable energy as one example, because effectively every infrastructure, because of the design and the needs, has a different context. As you can see from my background, we have started really working on renewable energy as IUCN, but really trying to understand the link between the renewable energy and biodiversity. So as a context, I mean, it was a really challenging conversation, I have to say, at the beginning, because we all really support renewable energy, and it's no questions that we need more. And I mean, we're looking at the data right now, we have only 11% of global consumption of energy comes from renewable. So we still have lots to develop. So it is so important that we realize that we really need to make sure that we are prepared. So it's this preparedness that has brought together actually in our projects, both developers like industry and NGOs. But when we start looking at the numbers, and there are two really good papers out there that look at the intersection between areas important for biodiversity. So we're looking at protected areas and key biodiversity areas, intersection of these and existing large-scale solar, wind, and hydro. And what that research identifies is that 17% of the existing ones intersect with areas important on biodiversity. 17, it's huge. And another study has looked at the intersection between areas that are with high potential for wind and solar, and KBAs and the range of threatened species. And they came up with a number that is 3.1 million hectares of KBAs could be affected, and 1,574 threatened species could be affected. So this calls for the need to be attentive in preempting the problems. So on this, and I'm thinking, I know I have 10 minutes, so I'm trying to organize my thinking into also something concrete and recommendations. You talked about Nogo. In the work we have done, we realized that, like many other sectors, but even more, I have to say, in the renewable, we realized that the importance of early decision-making, early planning is really makes the big difference. There is very little opportunity for restoration, because these areas, once you have developed them as sites for renewable, they stay. A lot of the impact is it cannot be offset. So the most important really action is on the avoidance and therefore early planning. And this is where the concept of Nogo comes, which are basically decisions early on by regulators to say certain type of areas should not be explored. But when we talked about no-go in our group, we thought, actually, let's be constructive. And instead of talking about no-go areas, let's talk about go areas. What are the areas that would actually be most prone for development for, let's say, renewable energy, intersecting their, obviously their potential in terms of hydro, in terms of wind, for example, and solar, but also the fact that maybe they're already degraded area, former agricultural area that are not in use anymore, including, for example, there is a whole discussion now, especially in Europe, in terms of using roofs, using, sealed areas. And there is a lot of potential there. Of course, this might be complicated in certain situations because areas that might have already other owners, but is to work out better where to go rather than not to go. But once you have identified these no-go areas and really embedded them into, plans, then there is another point that, yes, you do have to get a really good understanding of what are the best practice, because even in the construction and operations, even if you are in an area that is a go area that is less risky, you still have to implement good practices. And we have looked in detail about, what are best practices along what we call the mitigation hierarchy. And again, is about avoidance and minimize first, and then restore, but also enhance. And then we realized there are a lot of opportunities in the renewable sector, especially in wind and solar, to enhance biodiversity, especially when they go in areas that have low biodiversity, because you can, replant, you can manage nature. And we had some extremely interesting examples that are being, and there's still ongoing research about pollinators in solar farms, and how much this can be, they can coexist. But again, that means that the original state of the land was low quality, and therefore the enhancement improves the quality rather than actually having a loss at the beginning. Another point is really the importance of financial institutions to support the best practices by integrating also in the financial decision making some safeguards. And then last but not least is the question that was mentioned at the beginning. Let's not forget the upstream impacts, all the materials that are being used to, for the infrastructure. And I'm thinking, okay, about renewable energy, you have the infrastructure, then you have all the batteries. That is so important. So, and really thinking about those in a circular way. So it's not just the sourcing, responsibly sourcing, but it's also about what are you going to do once you actually close the site, with, this amounts of waste that we are going to accumulate. So think about it early on, because otherwise we're going to find mountain of waste in areas. And then I'm thinking about, I've seen some amazing sites in the desert in Mexico and in Mexico, and then what is going to happen then with all this million of plates that are going to be left there. So that is an important conversation to have early on, because this is important. This is in the agreements between the regulators and the utilities right from the start, saying what are you going to be doing when you decommission the area or repower the area. So another point that I wanted to make is therefore the importance of science, especially when you do go on the initial assessment, how important, how valuable the areas are. So an example from India, and I was just talking with colleagues from BirdLife and TNC, they were telling me about examples from India where your commitment to install 175 gigawatt of renewable capacity by 2022. And I know TNC has done a lot of work, and they have done an assessment that this expansion could threaten 10,000 kilometers square of forest in 2,500 kilometers square of, or what we call important bird areas, which are part of the KBA, let's say, family. And most of this is in particular region in Rajasthan. One of the key species that we are, that are under threat is the great Indian bustard. And this is really particularly under threat because of their transmission lines. There is a way to solve this, and the way is again about planning and in advance, understanding the area with science, carrying out these sensitivity maps, and being able to identify areas where to move infrastructures and where to, rather than, just therefore avoidance by really avoiding the project in certain areas. Again, this is TNC analysis that has identified the possibility there is 12 times more the land needed to achieve the targets in areas that will not affect these species, for example. So this is just a small example, but how science and policy really need to come together, And as we know, biodiversity is local, is very specific to the areas, and the knowledge about that area is key. And it has to be really generated before decisions are made. And as IUCN, we have done this work before with other kind of critical issues where we have set up, actually even in India with the dam report, we have set up independent experts panel to come and do a proper scientific assessment on certain questions related to development. And this science is fed into the decisions of businesses, so or policymakers. So of course, the earliest, the better. We know that avoidance is the most cost-effective and conservation-effective solution. Last point on something about that IUCN is really strongly supporting right now is the green recovery. And we all in this space right now, and unfortunate times of having to talk about recovery, but in a way is also an opportunity. And the opportunity is if these funds will be spent, and they have to be spent to restart all our crippled economies, it is really critical that this is spent in activities that will not hurt more the environment, but also actually the other way around, create opportunity for conservation. As IUCN, we have certainly one thing to put on the table, which are the nature-based solutions and the nature-based solution standards, and the opportunity of investing in this kind of projects which create co-benefits for people, for nature, but also people in terms of social benefits, but also jobs. So I think our colleagues in India are also very knowledgeable about this, can certainly provide additional links about what do we mean by nature-based solutions. And in general, IUCN position, and this will, is a Director General initiative, is really that at least a minimum of 10% of the recovery investments should be directed to nature-based solutions. And this is what we will ask all, states to really commit to, because we really feel like this is, a benefit for, is something that we can really get out of this recovery moment that will really benefit all. So on this, I will maybe put in the chat a couple links to some of the documents that I have mentioned, and actually listed. Last but not least, I will also link to a recent UNEP document that really talks about infrastructure. IUCN participated in that as well, which are principles that are really how to develop infrastructure early on. What are the key principles for early decision making, which I think also could be really relevant for the discussion today. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carbon. And you spoke about the need for early planning and building safeguards early enough. And that, I think, is our cue to bring in Mr. Srivastav from the Aditya Birla Group, to bring in the industry perspective on how they've been looking at biodiversity issues in their planning of investments in infrastructure. Mr. Srivastav, I would also sort of like to understand from you if there is a perception within the business community that biodiversity is important for business, especially in the context of your bottom lines. If you're looking at the key role that biodiversity plays, not just as CSR activities, but in mainstream business decision making. And what would you say that is being done differently now that may be seen as an additionality to private sector commitment to biodiversity conservation compared to what was being done earlier? So over to you, Mr. Srivastav.
Right. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm audible. And first of all, my proud privilege and honor to be here as a part of this distinguished panel. And really, would like to thank IUCN, UNEP for giving us this opportunity. Aditya Birla Group, as you know, that is a very diversified group. And we have, the businesses like cement and the concrete, which is there very much used into the infrastructure. We have got things like the metal, the aluminum and copper, they go for transmission lines. Then we have pulp and fiber, chemical, and so on. So then, as you asked this question, Divya, about that what the businesses are doing, and especially mainstreaming the biodiversity aspects, let me tell you that these are very much part of the business. First of all, like we have the initiatives for circularity, or we have the resource efficiency or the decarbonization, and in fact the mention of the nature-based solutions. So some of those are there very much ingrained into the business strategy and planning today. And in fact, this was there for some period of time. And those kind of initiatives are having, I would say, positive bearing onto the biodiversity. And there are ample, those kind of examples or the ways of explanation that how this helps in terms of the improvement of the biodiversity in that area where the wastes are getting, minimized and getting utilized into the operations. So I'm not touching upon that aspect. I'm just coming on to that question which you asked about, what are the direct actions today we have there, and what has changed now, which was not there earlier. So let me tell you that our example where we have got a more of a structured approach for this biodiversity protection as well as conservation. And let me explain you how we have evolved this over a period of time that right away, and there was a mention of biodiversity policy. So that was the kind of a commitment right from the top for going for things like not only compliance, but going much beyond the compliance aspects. And let me explain you that it starts right from the risk assessment through the IBAT tool. Then it goes in terms of the detailed biodiversity assessment site-wise. And here is a big role of IUCN comes into play, where in very close association with IUCN, we have developed those assessment reports. And then what is more important is the biodiversity management plans site-wise. And herein, I would like to take the example of the mitigation strategies, the hierarchies which are there for avoidance of the kind of the risks and issues, whether it's emissions, effluents, or noise, and then moving on to the minimization and finally into the restoration. So you have got in all the three aspects, into physical, into the biological, where all this biota and the flora, fauna we have talk about, the species and habitat we talk about. And let me also extend it further, which you said beyond though, but then is participation of community into the conservation measures. So socio-economic aspects. But specific measures, if you ask me, and these are very much emphasis as a part of the BMPs, That is, you have got the intensive plantation, afforestation programs. You have things like the water-related interventions within the fence, beyond the fence. Then we have got the bird-related kind of a conservation programs, butterflies, and so we have eco parks developed in the mine restoration areas. So that is something. And finally, into the kind of in a medium and long term, seeing the kind of the no net loss kind of thing, and even net gain kind of thing. So we have got those offset related projects now envisaged as a part of overall plans. And what is important that these are also to be having the budgeting provisions, have to have the time frames for every action. So you have detailed out the actions and how these are going to be met in different times. So these are also part of that. So what I would say that the things have changed from just meeting, to be just there at some compliance requirement for clearance or some other aspects, doing something beyond, and that the corporate sector is looking forward to. And we can see that how we can do this in partnership with the government, especially with the state government, with the local government. We have the community, we have the other stakeholders like local NGOs, and that would be the real key when we take these efforts beyond our factory boundary, because many of these offset projects are being carried out elsewhere, and therein we have to have those kind of supports. We need to have the kind of participation from other stakeholders only. Then we'll see the success of these programs. So I think I just stop here, and should there be any more questions? Divya, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Srivastav. No, that was very interesting to hear about how some of these concerns are being, sort of integrated, even in terms of creating risk profiles and mitigation measures. I'm going to now move to Sanjay Upadhyay and sort of bring in a more sensitive issue on the legal framework and the role of the judicial system in settling some of the concerns that have been coming up in the infrastructure wildlife conflict. So Sanjay, India, of course, has a very strong legal and regulatory framework when it comes to wildlife protection. However, infrastructure development has often led to public debate, and if I can use the word, public outcry around biodiversity loss. There has also been a trend, if you can call it so, in terms of judicial intervention to settle some of these concerns. What would you make of these trends? I mean, how would you interpret the growing role of judiciary? And how would you say that the legal framework in terms of laws, institutions, and approaches has evolved to address some of the issues around biodiversity and infrastructure that are coming up repeatedly in different parts of the country?
Thanks, Divya. Thank you, UNEP. Thank you, IUCN, for the opportunity. I hope I'm audible. It's a lot of thoughts sort of rumbling in my head right now with those questions. And fortunately, or I don't know, unfortunately for me, I represent both sides of the coin in courts. So I do represent linear infrastructure development in courts, and I also oppose a lot of infrastructure projects, which I think, or at least my clients think, are not very good for the biodiversity, from the biodiversity standpoint. But let me set the context by asking a bigger question. I think the first and foremost issue about linear projects is my right of way. And there's always a debate between my right of way versus my right to biodiversity. So I think this is the moot question. What is, who's preferring what? Which sector is really talking about? And right of way, when you talk to people who are into linear infrastructure, especially, for them, right of way is the biggest right, more than the fundamental right, because that's where their bread and butter is. That's where their entire work really, revolves around. But let me give you the, you said that the legal framework is rather strong. And I was trying to sieve through the legal framework, and let me give you some examples of that. First and foremost, most big linear infrastructure projects actually do not require environmental impact assessments. to begin with. So if you look at, for example, railways, which is one of the biggest in railway linear infrastructure, railway technically does not require environment impact assessments. Inland waterways, for example, which is the new flagship program, the Pragati program of the Prime Minister, again does not require an environment impact assessment, legally speaking. Transmission lines actually do not require environmental impact assessments. But what does require, or what do require, is slurry pipelines or irrigation projects. But at the same time, if you want to convert, and a lot of state governments converted with a sleight of hand irrigation projects to drinking water programs, because often drinking water programs and irrigation projects are clubbed and integrated. So you'll find a lot of irrigation projects turning overnight into drinking water pipeline projects, which do not require environmental impact assessments. Highways, of course, do require new highways, but the latest trend is not about new highways, but about expansion of highways. So the moment you talk about expansion of highways and you're less than 100 kilometers, then you do not require environmental impact assessments. So I think we need to really look, and why is this? Is this by design? Is this by default? In my understanding, it is certainly by design, because it is considered to be, essential services, so to speak. So there is some kind of a design to it that such huge linear infrastructure projects do not require EIA. But is that all? I mean, does the EIA framework limits the environmental assessment of linear infrastructure projects? The answer is no, because but before that, this 100-kilometer highway criteria is a very interesting one. And just yesterday, we were in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has now questioned, through Association of Democratic Reform NGO, whether this 100-kilometer exemption that is given is correct in law or not. So again, it's under judicial scrutiny. There are some other things, I'll come to that very quickly. So that's really important to know that today the courts are very, very active. Just to give you an example, inland waterways, the NGT has been dealing with it. The Supreme Court has been dealing with it for about 5 years or so, whether environmental clearance is really required or not. So these are under judicial scrutiny, whether these kind of projects require EIA framework or not. Now, when you look at the administrative framework, it's amazing, because there are about, and I'm sure Ms. Uma Devi is very aware of this, there are as many as 120 office memos that at least we have dug out on linear projects, forest and environment impact assessments. The issue ranges from investigations, surveys, from simplifying procedures, tree felling, linear plantations, regularization of encroachment, general approval for public projects, public importance projects, access to fuel stations on highways, repair and maintenance of roads, widening and realignment of canals, roads, upgradation of kacha roads to pakka roads. What happens when the road passes through a protected area network? How do you upgrade border roads? The Ministry of Defense requirements, 100 kilometers from the line of actual control. I can go on and on. So there are many, many such administrative steps that have been taken, which in my understanding is not very well known. Because if there are at least 120 dictats from the Ministry of Environment and Forest on just linear projects, then we ought to know about it in terms of what happens on the ground and whether that is being conformed to or not. Now, is there a logic to no EIA? As I said, it is rather, at least in my understanding, it is perhaps because they are considered essential services. But when you look at the biodiversity law in this country, whether that is applicable to such linear infrastructure projects or not, the answer is yes. Because if you look at the Biodiversity Act itself, there is something called BIA, which I now call it Biodiversity Impact Assessment of any project such as linear infrastructure projects. And unfortunately, and I'll say that on record, Ministry of Environment feels that if you have an EIA framework, if you have a Forest Conservation Act framework, if you have a wildlife law framework, you don't really require a biodiversity impact assessment. And I'm saying it with some confidence because they come up with an affidavit saying that. Lawyers talk with evidence, so I'm talking through some evidence here. So I think this is something which is a little out of the ordinary when you look at the biodiversity perspective itself. Because otherwise, what happens to biodiversity hotspot areas if you don't really implement the Biodiversity Act? Biodiversity Act is not just about NBS giving some guidelines or SBBs, which is the state biodiversity boards giving some directives, or go and prepare some people's biodiversity registers and so on. They are all important. But the biodiversity impact assessment, in my humble view, is very, very critical, especially for linear projects. So I think that is really important. And even if you don't have an EIF framework, for example, in railways and inland waterways, etc., I think if you look at the biodiversity standpoint, if you look at the wildlife standpoint, if you look at the forest standpoint, if you look at the Forest Rights Act standpoint, then in my opinion, safeguards assessment is rather strong. And I think we need to look at from those perspectives. Also, if you look at most linear infrastructure, which are funded by the banks of the world, whether it's the World Bank or the ADB, you'll find that there is a huge framework of social and environmental safeguards assessment that is done, including for power lines, including for power grids. I remember doing several environmental assessments. They have something called the ESMF reports, which is the Environmental and Social Management Framework. And I think that is the document that actually gets part of the agreement of loan agreement. So it's not as if you're doing linear projects, you are sort of left high and dry without any safeguards. So there are these very important instruments. The trick is to know them. The trick is to understand what is being signed on paper and whether that is being translated on the ground. And I think that's really the problem. Of course, there are some other issues which I wanted to highlight very quickly. One is the reality of who came first, whether it was the railway line which came and then there was a sanctuary on top of it, or there was a reserve forest on top of it, or vice versa. So this question is often asked because even today, a good number of protected areas or a good number of reserve forests are still not finally settled. And I say it again with evidence, 60 to 70% of the protected areas, even today, do not have a final notification, which means the rights are not settled in these areas. So people still do not know whether they are in or out of that PA. That is number one. I have encountered several examples of what is called as PRF, the proposed reserve forest. Again, notified in the 60s, we are still not completed the process of settlement. So I think these are some of these irritants that we really need to come out very strong and very quickly. Then, of course, as Sukumar mentioned about how do you ensure mitigation measures, whether there's a framework. But I have a more important question. If we are really, really serious about biodiversity and wildlife habitats, where are the critical wildlife habitats as envisaged in law? And this is not a no-go area administratively speaking. This is a no-go area or a no development zone as prescribed by law. But today we don't have a single critical wildlife habitat as envisaged under the Forest Rights Act, for example. We don't have very many biodiversity heritage sites that our law on biodiversity speaks about. Now, these are the areas which are actually no-go areas legally. But we haven't really become serious about it for reasons best known to everybody who matters in the decision-making process. But my idea is, or at least my understanding is, that the moment you declare these areas as critical from the wildlife standpoint or the tiger standpoint or a biodiversity standpoint, these areas will always be a no-go area. And that is the fear of maybe the administrative framework, that if you declare something a no-go area, then you cannot develop that area. But for God's sake, this is only 1% of this country. If you actually talk to ecologists, they'll tell you that out of the 4.3% protected areas that we have, not even 0.9% is real forest. And for God's sake, can we save this 1% of that forest or 1% of the landmass of this country and make it a critical wildlife habitat, make it a biodiversity heritage so that we can save it for posterity? There are other issues, with how we can strengthen the siting criteria, how we can actually improve the alternative assessment criteria, how can we have a strong monitoring framework, which Sukumar talked about. any given clearance, you'll find there are 40 to 100 conditions. It is like a post facto clearance in many ways. So who's monitoring those 100 conditions on a daily basis? On an average, the ministry has gone and told the National Green Tribunal that we can monitor this project once in 4.5 years. And that's the affidavit of the Ministry of Environment and Forests. So if you're going to monitor a project after 4.5 years on an average, you can imagine how are we doing or how are we faring as far as monitoring is concerned. So this is an important element. Just yesterday, again, there was a huge talk about the independent regulator, which the Lafarge judgment, many of you may know, talked about that India needs an independent regulator and an office of an independent regulator. So again, yesterday, the Honorable Chief Justice has asked the government, and hopefully we'll get some answers to that. But unless we have answers to these questions, I'm afraid we'll keep having this debate about right of way versus right of biodiversity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sanjay, for raising some very pertinent issues. I'm not going to try and summarize, but I'll flag a few key issues that seem to be emerging from this discussion. But before that, let's take a look at the questions in the chat box. There is the second question first, which speaks about biodiversity in the context of projects that are cleared in national interest. And I think Sanjay alluded to some of these issues. What would be the solution is the question. And as Sanjay said, there's really no solution as such, but I don't know if Sanjay, if you want to say anything more to the point being raised here.
No, what I said was, no, certainly there's a solution. I mean, when you talk about national interest, the way you define national interest. For example, there's this new EIA which says 100 kilometers, which there's already an OM on that, 100 kilometers from line of actual control. Now, it is important that we have defense projects. It's important that we have border projects. But who says we cannot consult the people who are sitting on the borders? Our citizens who are sitting on the borders. Who says we cannot have a public consultation with them? So I think it's all about how you define your interests and how your national interests or so on and so forth. I also talked about a strong monitoring framework. I mean, who is setting up this framework? If you're clearing projects with so many conditions, there ought to be a much better mechanism to monitor whether those conditions are being fulfilled or not. So those are the solutions. When you do a siting criteria, those are your solutions. Who's examining the alternatives? Is it about, I've seen so many cases in Delhi, for example, when the second ring road was being made, it was about, please cross it from my farmhouse so that I can get more compensation, rather than what is needed for the city. So I think there are huge debates where we need to be very honest to ourselves when we talk about these projects and what we need for the country as a whole.
Thanks, Sanjay. The second, it's more a comment than a question, is on an integrated agroforest mosaic landscape management approach, rather than looking at biodiversity conservation in a very sectorally fragmented manner, for instance, forest biodiversity or agrobiodiversity. How do we bring all this together and have this integrated landscape approach that we were talking about? So let me ask Dr. Sukumar for his views on this, and then if Dr. Carbon has anything to say on this from her international experience.
Yeah, actually, if you had noticed, I never used the word protected area throughout my 10 minutes talk about, because I have now a very strong advocate of the landscape approach. I think the protected area, increase in area and so on in India, it's a story that has played out. I think it has played a role in the past. It has definitely played a role in conserving our wildlife species, many wildlife species. But I think it's a story that, it's not going to continue into the future. The 5% of whatever that we have attained is, I think, the maximum that is possible under the circumstances. So we really need to get into integrated landscapes, sustainable, what I call sustainable landscapes. And those landscapes have to address, not just the conservation of the tiger or the elephant or whatever, but the entire biodiversity in the context of a changing climate. And this is something that I have been flagging for many, many years. asking for more policy discussions. But we need to bring in, I mean, I'm a biologist, and without sound economics, we just can't achieve sustainable landscapes, because sustainable landscapes will have, a certain elements of protected areas. It will have private lands, agricultural lands. It will have towns and cities and villages and so forth. It will have a whole host of different forms of land use. And how do you compensate people who maintain biodiversity or wildlife-friendly land use patterns on their lands so that you achieve sustainable landscapes? I think that's the new research agenda that we need to pursue in our country. And I think that's really the future of conservation in our country. So, the protected area paradigm that started in 1972, we had some PAs before that, but after the Wildlife Protection Act and the launch of Project Tiger, with Project Elephant in 1990, we introduced the concept of landscapes even before the Project Tiger did. Project Tiger was hung up so much on just individual protected areas with core area and buffer zones. We had a more inclusive approach in Project Elephant by recognizing that there are people, and this is historical. Okay, we can't wish away people. We can't wish away thousands and thousands of people who are settled in natural landscapes. Much before many of our cities and towns developed. So we need to move towards sustainable landscapes, but we need to bring in not just the biologists like me, but also the sociologists. We need to bring in the anthropologists. We need to bring in the economists, resource economists, and then really plan for sustainable landscapes. And I think the other anomalies, if you notice, I'm not saying that just because there is a PA, there should be no upgradation of a road, or there should be no road net, or no linear infrastructure to it. I think that's also impossible. But I think once you start moving from the PA to the sustainable landscape approach, I think many of the other concerns about loss of biodiversity, and here's where we need to bring in the science in terms of viable populations. We need to bring in the concepts of genetic variability, genetic diversity. But today, unfortunately, what has happened is people use these terms in a very loose sense. Gene flow will be lost, But what is exactly? There is a whole biological theory of gene flow that is needed to ensure that there is insufficient genetic diversity of a species. But people, unfortunately, have started using these and even other terms like wildlife corridors in a very loose sense. There are all kinds of fictitious corridors being invented, all across the country, just because there's a tiger that moves through an agricultural area or through a minor forest area, or an elephant moves somewhere. We should at least make sure that those all again don't, but unfortunately that gets into the popular narrative. And I think that has also given conservation a very bad name. So we need to have a scientific approach, a sensible approach. We need to have an inclusive approach, make sure that people don't suffer. Because today, I mean, let me tell you that because of elephants moving outside elephant reserves in a very large way are really causing havoc across agricultural landscapes, killing people, causing huge amount of damage. It's nothing to do with fragmentation of habitats or PAs or anything that's happening inside. It's a completely different story altogether. So we definitely need to move towards sustainable landscapes as the new conservation paradigm in our country. We started with biosphere reserves, the UNESCO biosphere reserves, but unfortunately, it's not been given the importance that it should have been given. And in a recent dialogue of IPBES and IPCC, had bring in the concept of biosphere reserves more strongly into it and so on. So that's the direction into which we should move. That's a new conservation paradigm for the country. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sukumar. Dr. Carbon.
Yeah, let me just, I know also I'm conscious of time, but just a couple points. Definitely the whole integrated approach is a must. And I think we really need to, we have said enough that we have to embrace it. But I think what is important is to understand why there's so much blockage in actually doing it, because until we don't understand what are the pushbacks and what are the reasons why it's not a natural approach, we will just do it as a lip service in presentations, but it will never happen. And it's because it's about people's interests. It's about prioritizing. There has to be a proper process behind to get people at the table at the same time and negotiate the trade-offs, because an integrated approach will require some trade-offs. As part of the integrated approach, I just wanted to mention one type of assessment that I think is more and more important, because we are, in more people in more crowded spaces, is really the cumulative impact assessments that really need to have a stronger seat at the table. And usually are, you have the impact assessment at the project level, you have a strategic assessment at the policy level. But I think having more experience and really thinking about the cumulative effects is becoming really also an important element. And that will help also thinking about integrated, looking at not only my project, but looking at how my project is affecting the bigger picture. That's it. That's my additional input on this question.
Thank you very much. No, that is an important insight of looking at landscape approaches and integration, not just in terms of the conservation approach, but also in terms of the cumulative impacts. So thank you very much. This has been a very engaging session, and some very interesting issues have come up. Of course, we've spoken at length on the whole issue of landscape approach to conservation. And Dr. Sukumar brought in the necessity to bring in multiple disciplines when we talk about this landscape approach. He spoke about the importance of bringing in the economics of biodiversity conservation. And this is even from UNEP's perspective, this is something that we are laying a lot of emphasis on. How do you value biodiversity and bring these values into developmental decision making? We have a project called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity TEEB, which is a global project. In India, this project is being implemented in agri-food ecosystems. So the idea is to apply this conceptual framework to a local agricultural setting and to see what kind of policy instruments can sort of, be based on the values of biodiversity locally and can be the basis for agriculture-related decision-making at a local level. So whether it's payment for ecosystem services or the kinds of subsidies or support that is to be provided to farmers, how can the values of biodiversity play a critical role in this decision-making framework? Another very important issue of objective evidence in science and infrastructure planning. One issue that came up repeatedly was on infrastructure corridors versus biodiversity conservation areas, and how do we bring this concept into the environmental legal framework of the country. And I think this is an important issue for us to think about. And finally, the safeguard assessments independent of EIAs and the related issue of compliance and monitoring. So there's some very interesting issues and insights from the panelists on each of these, very nuanced insights based on their experience. I don't see there are any more questions. There is just one more question, but I think we will request our attendees and participants to write into us with any further questions, and we will take them up with the panelists and get back to you on these questions. Please feel free to get in touch with us for any other questions as part of this discussion, or any other issues that you would like to engage with engage with the panelists on. We'll be happy to take this forward. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Vivek Saxena for his final remarks.
Thank you, Divya. And I'm really grateful to all the eminent panelists and all the participants for having joined on this very, very important webinar series. And I'm really grateful to UNEP also for partnering with IUCN on this very important topic, as post-2020 biodiversity framework is very, very relevant. And as per this talk of taking that the targets which we had set for the Aichi biodiversity targets and all, we have not achieved any of the targets with the fully. And now again, the challenge is that what targets we set for 2030 and 2050. This achievement of these targets is possible only if, while planning for various infrastructure projects also, we address the concerns related to the biodiversity conservation also. And we had really very, very important suggestions, deliberations, and comments from all the relevant issues related to the business and biodiversity sector from the policy perspective point of view from Ms. Uma Devi from Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, the legal issues from Mr. Sapadhyay, Mr. Raman Sukumar from the Wildlife Species Conservation and Corridor Connectivity point of view, Mr. Sandeep Srivastava, the real experience that how the corporate sector is going to plan and integrate the sustainability and biodiversity conservation concerns into the business practices. So, and also from the transport sector, how the cleaner sources of energy can be one of the solutions for ensuring biodiversity conservation. Ms. Carbon Julia mentioned that and also shared some of the IUCN knowledge products to the link provided in the chat box, that how the solar projects or wind energy projects they need to have addressed and in what way the guidelines should address the biodiversity conservation aspect also. So I'm again thankful to each and everyone for making this webinar very successful. And we were seeing that a large number of participants. This was also being live on the YouTube. So we really had a very good participation. If there are any further questions and suggestions, you can always send to us. And looking forward for future such webinars. Thank you very much. And over to Dilya.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saxena. Atul, would you like to say a few words right at the end?
No, nothing. I just wanted to thank Uma Devi ji for being here with us throughout this seminar. And there were some very interesting aspects that came up. And I think IUCN and UNEP should think of how to follow up on some of the issues that have come up and in fact present them to the ministry as a thought paper. That could be a possibility to move forward. I was also seeing on the question and answer and the chat, there were a few very interesting questions that came up. And I think we should, Vivek, try to see that we are able to respond to them separately since we're running short of time. But thanks a lot, Uma Devi ji. Thanks, Amit. I think he's left already. Thanks, Raman ji. Thanks, everyone. Sanjay, Carbon, and Srivastav ji for some excellent discussions. And have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.